Hey everyone, welcome back to Big Strong Book. I'm Reed, and today I'm going to be discussing the second half of Shadow and Claw, The Claw of the Conciliator by Gene Wolfe. So Claw of the Conciliator is, it's the second half of Shadow and Claw, but it is the second of four parts that make up the Book of the New Sun. Claw of the Conciliator is, very much so like Shadow of the Torturer in that we're still wading through Earth. We're still wading through this world that is dense, at least in terms of how it's described to us by Severian, the protagonist and the narrator, and just in how it's a world that is so impacted by things that appear magical but are probably scientific. And there's the sheen of fantasy around it when it is in fact a science fiction novel. That's well known though, and I talked about that in my review of Shadow of the Torturer. This review, as I said in Shadow of the Torturer, it is still very difficult to review it, even spoiler free. But I'm sure if I went down the laundry list of every single thing that happens in this book, those who have never read it would actually be none the wiser, because it's so, the plot is not at the core of what these books are about. It's about memory, and how memory plays a role in becoming who you are, or memory is a part of what makes us who we are. That's at the core of it. And in this book, I will mention some basic plot points from the end of Shadow of the Torture. So the first part of this will be some light, very minor spoilers. Out of context, you have no idea what they mean. Very light spoilers for Shadow of the Torturer. And then I'm going to transition into, the best way I can describe it is a crazed theory that I have about the series, about the nature of the plot. That is probably, I know it can't be true. It was just a theory that popped into my head, and I have this platform to kind of express what I think is going on in this story halfway through the whole thing, even though I am certain that I am dead wrong and that the theory can be picked apart 20,000 different ways, and it has absolutely no credibility to it. It won't stand up against any sort of judgment or scrutiny. That being said, I'll kind of go into describing, what this book is about and how it differs. How Claw of the Conciliator differs from Shadow of the Torturer. I found that the second book is it's much more complex than Shadow of the Torturer in terms of the pacing and the kind of you feel like you're jerked around a lot. But one thing that I really liked about Claw of the Conciliator was the fact that Severian really feels like he's coming into his own. I felt, I guess, more, I don't know if, whether it's empathy or sympathy, that's the right word, but I felt more for him, more of the pain that he feels as he continues this seemingly endless journey. That is even more present than I felt that it was in the first book. In the first book, it was more so just he's at the beginning of his journey, but now that he's really settling into everything, and he's coming into what I would consider a significant amount of power, particularly with the title object of the book, The Claw of the Conciliator, which of course he had, again, light spoilers for Shadow of the Torturer, which Severian has the Claw of the Conciliator in his possession. We learn in this book the kind of power that it has. But this book, it kind of like the beginning of the first book, the opening chapter of Claw of the Conciliator really just kind of throws everything for a loop, and it's like, okay, we're jumping back into this world, but we're not jumping right back into where the first book ended, where this is like months, if not years in the future, in this town called Saltus. I mean, I feel like variously it was described as months passing or years passing, where he's with Jonas, the character who was briefly introduced in the last 2 or 3 pages of Shadow of the Torturer. And Jonas is a very fascinating character, and you learn a lot more about him here. And still, my God, very confusing things happen to him that I'm not sure what the hell happened towards the end of it. But, Severian has kind of come into his own in Saltis, and he is still haunted by the memory of Thecla. Haunted by her memory. Her memory of him. And there are two sides. Something happens in this where their memories are starting to come together a little bit, and he's obsessed with Thecla, which of course is strange because in the first book, in Shadow of the Torturer, it seems like they really barely knew each other at the end of the day, but he constantly says how much he knows her, how much he cares about her, and he was obsessed with her back then. So I understand that, but yeah, and then the journey continues, and he goes past Saltis, and it's a lot of ping-ponging around the map. But then when Severian goes to the play to I guess the second big set piece, I'll just, without spoiling it, the second or third set piece of this novel, that is when I started to get some very weird, I don't know if you could call it premonitions or ideas for things about the plot that really started to confuse me. But then I was thinking of things that maybe made those elements make more sense. And then the aspect of the ending as well. So I think that not a lot, but that I think that's as much as I can say completely spoiler free, or pretty much spoiler free for Claw of the Conciliator, beyond things that are discussed in the first couple chapters. So again, as I said before, this theory that I have, it is a very crazed theory. I know it is not true because from what I've read, and this applies as far as I can tell to every single one of Gene Wolfe's books, and he wrote quite a few, nobody gets it on the first go around. You might think you do, but you don't. And you only really get it on a reread or multiple read-throughs. So I know that if I am getting this idea now, halfway through the tetralogy, there's no way it's real or it's valid. It could be valid in part. Who knows? Maybe some of the things I'm talking about have some bearing and bear some fruit. But that, it's not the end-all be-all. So these will be full spoilers for Shadow of the Torturer and Claw of the Conciliator from this point out. So if you haven't read either of the first two books, don't read further. And who knows if people win the lottery, unlikely things happen. So if I am somehow remotely in the ballpark correct with this theory, I might have spoiled books 3 and 4. Who the hell knows? But so my theory started, or my thought process started when Severian goes back to the House Absolute and he meets the man in the yellow robe. And the man in the yellow robe, eventually Severian refers to him, or thinks that man in the yellow robe, who is the contact of Voldalis, is the Autarch. However, the Autarch seems to be working with Voldalis, who, prior to that point, the two of them seemed diametrically opposed. The Autarch House of the Power of Voldalis is kind of leading this more rebellious undercurrent type thing. And it's of Severian's belief that the Autarch might be an agent of Voldalis, or vice versa. Voldalis is an agent of the Autarch, which I guess makes sense in a way. We've seen those novels before in stories where a government, kind of like in 1984 by George Orwell, where a government will put up a great threat when the threat isn't really real or may not even exist at all. Just to kind of keep the people at bay, they'll invent an enemy. And Voldalis isn't invented, he is real, as insofar as we grasp from Severian's narration. Because he meets Voldalis and he meets, members of his I guess what you could call the inner court of Voldalis. But the autarch, indeed, if that was, and my theory hinges on, my theory accepts that Severian was telling the truth, or that the truth of the book is that the man in the yellow robe is in fact the autarch. It's kind of going off of there. So the man in the yellow robe, the autarch potentially, tells Severian that essentially that he must go back to Thrax, which he does somewhat, it seems, at the end of this book, but that he must then later return and kill the autarch. Now, that part of it isn't much of a surprise because, and especially it's made clear in the second book, that Severian will come into power, maybe as an autarch, maybe as something else. It's that is 100% evident. He mentions that he's in power in the House Absolute, which indicates that he's probably a future autarch. He mentions having, servants and advisors and all of that, and mentions taking the throne. So then the question was, if the man in the yellow robe is in fact the autarch, if Severian's apparent assumptions were in fact correct, why the hell does the autarch want Severian to kill him? Like, what purpose would that serve? Thinking of the autarch, what purpose would that serve? Now, what I think is, and now this other part of the theory hinges on how I am interpreting the very final scene of the Claw of the Conciliator. It's been hinted at and a little bit evident throughout the course of this series that time travel in some form exists within this world. Whether it's through that weird mirror contraption thing that Jonas disappeared in, which, that's a talking point for another day, I guess, and I'm sure that'll be more clear over time what the hell happened there, unless it was a spaceship or a teleporter or something. But the end of the book, where you have a Jolenta or Yolenta, Hildegrin, Dorcas, Severian, and they're kind of there with these women or these witches that can promise to save Jolenta, but it's almost like they have to go back in time and kidnap a doctor and then bring him forward into their present, or in relative terms, kind of the future, back to the future. And so they go back to the past, or it seems like they go back to the past, but then it seems like they're brought forward to the future, but Dorcas and Severian are the only ones left, or they're the only, they see each other, but they don't, all the others are gone. So here was what I was thinking. Again, I don't know where this thought came to me. It was just in me trying to parse out the autarch wanting Severian to apparently kill himself, the autarch, and the maybe time travel thing that happened at the end of the book. I do not think, again, I haven't even started Sword of the Lictor, which is the third book. I think that Dorcas and Severian were brought back to the past, but as they were brought forward to the future, but not the present they had just left. I think they went forward, but they're not all the way where they were before. I think that the autarch, which has been a presence this whole time, has been Severian all along. I am probably way off the mark with that. But I think Severian has been the autarch the entire time. And another reason why I think that is because prior to the weird time travel-y stone town thing that happened at the end of the book, one of the witches, I think, says that, you know what, I have the book right here, I'm gonna look for it. Let's see where it is. The young witch, so this is from, at least this version, this is page 500, so close to the end. The young witch nodded. All time exists. That is the truth beyond the legends the epochs tell. If the future did not exist now, how could we journey toward it? If the past does not exist still, How could we leave it behind us? In sleep, the mind is encircled by its time, which is why we so often hear the voices of the dead there and receive intelligence of things to come. And that ties a lot into what I'm thinking, where the story's going. Those who, like the mother, have learned to enter the same state while waking live surrounded by their own lives, even as the Abraxas perceives all of time as an eternal instant. So we get into time in a way that we haven't thus far. So I think Severian will go to Thrax, and he can go to Thrax because he still has that note that his master wrote to him about that he's, I think, tucked into the scabbard or whatever, the sheath of Terminus Est. So he'll go to Thrax, and then he'll complete his mission, who he thinks is to Voldalis, and then he'll kill the Autarch, but the Autarch will be the predecessor of the Autarch that we have already seen, when in fact the Autarch, the man in the yellow robe, is an older Severian. Again, my mind was just, I don't know where my mind went, but I thought about it, and I'm like, wow, that really could be what it is, about how the past, you can never shed the past. You can Severian. It works with Severian can never shed his past. You can't shed the past of the world. But what if the past of the world is in fact Severian's future, but it's actually the past? This probably isn't like a whole convoluted time travel thing at the end of the day. That's just what I was thinking. Then a few other things. I think, again, I would have to go back and see what the descriptors of the man in the yellow robe and Voldalis, this was something I had thought about, I think, even in the first book, was that the Autarch and Voldalis, if both were real, both were in fact the same person. That made more sense to me, that they would just be the same person. It would be the same person wanting power on all fronts. And there was a little thing, the coin that Voldalis gives Severian in the first chapter of Shadow of the Torturer. Do we know what's on that coin? Like I forget that. I don't necessarily want that answered right now, but I don't remember what's on that coin. But Severian in that chapter mentions all the coins we get have the face of the Autarch. What if the face of the Autarch is the same as the face of Voldalis? Voldalis and Autarch being the same person, both of them Severian. Again, bear with me. Then I thought that Thecla, being at least somewhat of a familiar to the Autarch and to Voldalis, is that she knows Severian. And I went back to the scene where Thecla and Severian first meet. And she is horrified or terrified, probably because if he has his mask on. I mean, she could just be terrified anyway. But then there's the little word of like growing merriment in her eyes. And this could be me reading way too much into the text. There's another thing, and which set my mind off, that thinking that I was on the right track. It was me just flipping back through the chapters. That's all it was. Was just me flipping back through the chapters to try to find things. So Master of the Curators. Okay. She smiled, and I felt, this is chapter 7 of Shadow of the Torturer. She smiled, and I felt as I had when I had been in the atrium of time and had come inside to a warm room and food. Probably a coincidence. I just thought, oh my God, Thecla is known to him, a familiar to him. And then the things about him loving Thecla, the things that seem weird and disjointed in that he's contradicting himself. What if he's not contradicting himself? What if they did happen, but they happen in the future. They happen in his future because he's back in the past, and he has a relationship with Thecla as the autarch. He has a relationship with Thecla as the autarch. And so she knows him, and that's why there's this weird connection. And because now he has Thecla's memories, what if he starts to see himself younger potentially, or see himself through a different light, or starts to see himself as the autarch and then realize, this is why I know Thecla? Because again, it seems weird that he's just adding things and making up stuff, but what if he isn't making up stuff about Thecla? And because he's writing this far in the future. It seems like he's writing it far in the future when everything has already happened. So maybe the stuff that he described doing with Thecla did happen, just not at this point in the narrative. They happen in the future chronologically, but it looks like they happened in the past. Again, weird. Another thing, and I don't remember specifically, the body in the necropolis at the beginning is probably either, if we don't know what it is, because I don't remember whose body that was, it's either Thecla, which means that scene does not take place at the beginning and it takes place further into the narrative. Or what if that body is Dorcas? Again, assuming my theory is correct, which it most certainly is not. Assuming that theory, they extract the body, Dorcas, and then she's buried in, or like set in that lake, the garden of endless sleep in Shadow of the Torturer. Doesn't Dorcas have memories of being in like a high tower somewhere when she hasn't? When that's maybe the explanation, is that Severian becomes the autarch and takes Dorcas with him. But then I had thought, well, what if Thecla is Severian's daughter? Or because daughter and half sister and all that's probably not true. But what if, and that the memories that Dorcas like Dorcas is a closed loop, meaning that the memories that she has actually have not happened to her yet. She has those memories because she has died, but now she's living through the future and the past. She's a closed loop, which means that she is never really born. What I mean by that is Severian wakes her up, or revives her, and now we know he was able to revive her because he had the claw of the Conciliator with him. That's why he was able to bring her back to life, or I assume so. So they go on this journey, and then both Dorcas and Severian are back in the past. So then they continue forward into the point, perhaps, when he becomes the autarch, and she lives with him, and she's inside the house absolute all the time. Something happens, she dies. And Severian, as Voldalis, extracts her body from the necropolis. I am way off with this. There's no way this theory is true. It's just, just in flipping through the books, I haven't found anything that has directly contradicted this. Of course, as I've said, I haven't even started the third book yet, so it is very possible. I'm going to start the third book, I'm going to get 10 pages in, and this whole theory is going to be thrown to crap, contradicted, and discredited entirely. And I'm okay. I'm okay with that happening. Just because I feel more engaged in the process of reading this book, I think, than I had at the end of Shadow of the Torturer. So that's a long-winded way of saying I think Severian, it doesn't just become the autarch, but that he is the autarch that has been present this whole time. Because now he's in the past. But that it's assumptions on the whole thing about the autarch and what he says to the man in the yellow robe saying to Severian, as well as the assumption of the nature of the ending of Claw of the Conciliator. I'm probably way off. But I accept that, and I'm okay with that. So, Claw of the Conciliator, if you guys have read it, let me know what you think. and I will see you guys next time.